Hey, welcome back to Mullet World. Today on the shed, they're going to be doing something of questionable merit. They're going to be putting $900 worth of suspension parts on this $125 Lotus frame. Are they really going to get back a worthwhile improvement from their investment? Or are they just throwing money away?
What are you doing? That's real money.
That and more on this episode of The Shed. Hey, welcome back to The Shed. I know the whole idea of putting expensive suspension parts on a cheap bike sounds kind of crazy, right? Well, let me tell you a little bit of backstory on this stuff. So you know about the Lotus if you've seen other episodes. I bought the frame for $250. It arrived damaged. It gave me $125 back. I rode the bike one time, took it apart. I finally put it back together this year for somebody else to ride, and I wound up riding it a bunch, and I wound up starting to like it. How crazy is that? You know, it's very old school geometry. It don't do a whole lot of nothing right, but some weird reason I've been enjoying it. And then the other part to that story is, maybe about a year and a half ago, Wolf Tick Video did a couple videos on the Xfusion trace fork, and I always wanted to try one. I don't want to misquote the Tick, but he said something like, if you put this fork on your bike, it'll make the world a better place. So I don't know about all that, but he made it sound like it was a pretty good fork. The thing was, I could never find one for a good deal. Like when I found them, they were expensive, and there was never no deals around. But that changed recently. We're going to get into that. We're going to talk about it more while I'm working on the bike. Let me just tell you real quickly, the fork we're talking about here is an Xfusion trace. It's 130 millimeter travel, 34 millimeter stanchions. It's a non-boost through axle, which is good because that wheel is not boost. It's got about 17 clicks of rebound dampening. Has lockout, and then under this cap is your air. I've already cut the steering tube. I cut all my forks to 7 3/4, and I know they fit on anything I got, so it's not locked into one particular bike. And I put the star nut in there already. Now that MSRP on that fork is $650, and then to go along with that, I bought a Xfusion 02 Pro RL shock, and yeah, it's a shock. It's basically a shock. It's got rebound dampening and not much else. Lockout. This actually, the MSRP is about $320. Now you know I didn't pay anywhere near that kind of money for these parts. I actually got the fork for $270 with free shipping on eBay. And the shock was $120 with $20 shipping on eBay. And there's a few other little parts we had to buy to make the shock work, but we'll get into that when we start working on the bike. All right, let's start with the rear shock. Notice this one here. This is a EXA Form R. I don't know nothing about it. It doesn't hold air very good. Maybe once a week loses all the air, but it holds the bike up. I don't know if there's any damping. It has a rebound knob. Does a little bit. So we got our new shock here. Something you got to notice is, okay, so it has bushings. I mean, it has spacers, but they're not the right width to fit the frame or the suspension part back here. So how do we deal with that? Well, we deal with that with some spacer kits from RockShox, which happens to be the same diameter as the Xfusion. Also, I have some 1/2 millimeter shims. If I can't get it exactly perfect, I could shim it. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is figure out what size bushing your shock has. Some of them are 12 millimeter and some of them are 12.7. So you got to do is pry one of these little bushings out with a screwdriver, and you can measure the pressed in bushing here. Now the thing is, also something I wanted to bring out, this has a bushing which is fine for this type of suspension, because there's really not much rotation going on. But if you have like a rocker arm pivot type suspension, you're better off using a needle bearing type bearing instead of a bushing, because on a rocker arm type there's a lot of rotation going on in here, and this type of bushing will wear out pretty quick. If this wasn't a new shock, if I was changing the bushings, I would use the needle bearing ones anyway. But because it's new and it has a bushing, I'm going to reuse what's there. Now the thing is, this little aluminum piece that came out of there, you need to measure it, because you need to know if that's 12 or 12.7. Now there may be other sizes. I've only run across 12 and 12.7 millimeter. This one is 12.7, which is the same as RockShox, most of the RockShox. So that's why I was able to use the regular RockShox kit. Okay, so what you need to do is, before you take the shock off, the original shock, you need to measure your spacing so that you know what size kits to get. And you need to be pretty accurate, because you don't want to put, if you were to use too small the spacer here, when you tighten that up, it would put a bind on these bearings, and it would make it move rougher, and it would wind up wearing the bearings out, you know, quicker. So you don't want no binding to be going on. You want the right amount of spacing in here. Alright, so let's see if we can make this fit. You know, it's funny because this bike, I really did not like it at first. The only thing that made me put it back together was a friend of mine needed something to ride. And I decided to put it together just out of parts so he would have something to ride. And then I started testing different parts on it. And I actually started liking the bike, which is kind of weird. But it's a very stable bike. It's got really long chain stays, like 455 millimeter, something like that. And even with the slacker kit, I think we're only somewhere around 69 degree. That one. So this has a slight bit of play. It had a washer in there, so I'm going to put that washer right back in. Let's see if we can get screw started. But anyway, the bike's really stable. Like under certain circumstances, the bike is incredibly stable. And I think that's what I've been liking, the area I've been riding a lot lately. It's a little faster than where I've ridden in the past. I have to check the air pressure on it. Now, let's get on to the fork. All right, so I took the wheel and front brakes off camera. We're going to take these apart and then we're going to weigh the forks. I think I know about what it weighs, but let me tell you about this fork though. This fork is not a bad fork. It's a Suntour XCR. It's 130 millimeter travel, 32 millimeter stanchions. It is a coil spring fork, but there's only one coil spring, and the other side has a lockout. And if you notice, it's got a rebound knob. And honestly, it's not a bad fork. And I have a feeling it's pretty heavy compared to the Xfusion fork. We're going to find out in a minute. But it was $75. I got that fork for $75 from, I think it's called Wiggle. It's like a company in, like an online, place in England, UK, whatever.
Like the Teletubbies, they wiggle.
Like Wiggle. That was the name of the site. And speaking of the UK, actually, this frame, this Lotus, I wanted to mention this. So there was a Lotus bicycle company, and I looked them up online and tried to find a picture of this frame, and I never could find this exact frame. So is this really a Lotus, or was this something happened in China and they just put the name on a frame they were selling? I really don't know. We're gonna get this, we'll get this little crown race off here. And we're gonna weigh this fork, and then we're gonna weigh the other one. So it's 5.20. 5.20. So about 5¼ pounds. So now we're going to weigh the Xfusion fork. $4.23. So it's almost exactly a pound lighter. I know this fork was nowhere near, the fork and shock were nowhere near the 900 like I mentioned in the beginning, but it's still not exactly budget. But I figure, down the road I could put it on something else if I wanted to, get a different frame or something. Right now I'm starting to enjoy riding this one. And all the spacers should work because I cut everything the same. 7 3/4, but sometimes there's a slight lack of accuracy when you're cutting things. Preload it a little bit. Probably got to adjust it on the ground though, but just for now. Or I'm going to stop the camera and get the wheel and brake on here. Might as well just be throwing the money away. All right, so it's all together. I'm going to start out with 80 pounds of air in the fork, 150 in the shock, rebound in the middle on both of them. Next step is test ride down Clayton Park. So I also have some footage that I'm going to show of the shock working going down the hill and the fork working going down the hill. And I'm going to try to match up with the new one so we can maybe see if there's any real difference. I think the main difference is going to be in the smoothness of it. I can tell sitting on the bike, just as it goes through its travel, it's way smoother. I think that's going to be a big part of it. So, on to Clayton Park. Okay, so right here on the left, we see the coil spring fork, the new Xfusion on the right. But just notice how rough. You can see even in the travel of the coil spring fork, how the travel is sort of rough. It's kind of on and off. Whereas you look at the Xfusion fork, it's very smooth. And this is the same trail, maybe not the exact same spot in the trail, but you can see the action in the Xfusion fork is so much smoother, and you can really feel that. All right, so now the rear shock you can't see the same thing like the fork, but what you can see is, if you look at the new shock on the right, see how much more it's moving. It's really reacting to the terrain so much better than the original shock. All right, we're coming up on the trail we had in the last video. We're going to try see how this fork is compared to the Suntour coil spring fork. I'm going to tell you, I definitely feel the smoothness of it. That's really the biggest thing. Like, when I'm going slower, it doesn't feel like it's doing anything better. But the faster I go, it really soaks things up. The original rear shock held the bike up, but it was very harsh. This one I could feel. See, right there I feel a little bit, I don't know. It's definitely smoother though. I can go pretty fast without thinking too much. Same thing with the fork. I think I got a little too much air pressure in it. Maybe a little too much rebound. It seems to be stuttering a little. But man, definitely nice. If you watch my channel, you know I like Bucklow's forks. And they work really good, but you can feel the difference between this and a Bucklow's. Okay, so we just got back from our ride. And the big question, of course, is, was it worth it? Was it worth spending that kind of money on this bike? Let me tell you a few things that I did notice. What was interesting to me is this fork was a pound lighter. Now on a hardtail, I noticed that right away. I didn't even notice the pound, honestly. It made no difference to me. And the harder you rode the bike, the better the fork worked. But when you're not riding real hard, it didn't seem to really deal with the small things very well, like roots and rocks and things like that. But when you rode it hard, it really did absorb it. And obviously, it was really smooth fork compared to the coil spring fork. The shock worked awesome. I think the shock was the biggest improvement of anything. You could tell how much smoother it was with the shock. And the bike overall, what really stood out to me is how, when I was going fast over rough terrain, I could change direction. Whereas with the old coil spring fork and the old shock, I basically had to point it and go. There was no change in direction in the middle of your trajectory. But I also want to bring out one other thing. You see, I got my Polygon out here, and I have that for a reason. My Polygon has a Suntour Aileron fork. That fork has a $679 MSRP price, and the Trace fork is a $659 MSRP. So they're basically in the same category. But I gotta say, my Suntour Aileron has high and low speed compression, and fast or slow, it has really good slow speed compliance to the terrain. So it's definitely a step above. Now the Trace fork is good. I'm not saying it's not, but I don't think it's as good as some other forks in the same category. So that's where we're gonna leave it. Whether it's worth it or not, that's kind of up to you. Do you want the better ride, or do you not? Does it not matter to you? It's really up to the individual who's spending the money. I'm going to leave it on there. It's going to stay on there till I get another frame. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Shed, and we'll catch you next time. $100 here, $100 there. Take that, Shed.